I also want to welcome our speaker tonight, Clay Risen. Maybe you've heard he and I speaking. But I also I want to read his biography if I can, because I told him he has possibly the coolest biography I've ever read. Clay Risen, the deputy op-ed editor at the New York Times, is the author of Single Malt, A Guide to the Whiskies of Scotland, and the spirits bestseller American Whiskey, Bourbon and Rye, A Guide to the Nation's Favorite Spirit. Now in its sixth printing with more than 100,000 copies sold, his groundbreaking guide has quickly become the Bible on American whiskey and placed Risen at the top of authorities on the history, business, and diversity of U.S. spirits. Risen has given numerous talks, appeared on television, and served as a judge on multiple spirit award committees. Risen has written widely about spirits for newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Forbes, The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. He is the author of several popular American histories, including A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination, The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act, and the book we're going to talk about tonight, The Crowded Hour, Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. He grew up in Nashville, now lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife and 2 young children. I want you to welcome Clay Risen, and as he said to me, he certainly wants to talk about tonight's book, but he said if you have, given the tenor of what's going on in the world, if you've got questions about anything else he's written, please feel free to ask. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat button. So if you've got a question, put it in, write it in chat, and at the end of his talk, we'll ask those questions. So without further ado, would you welcome Clay Risen?
Hey everybody. It's funny, having done these, I've not done a lot of Zoom talks like this, so the words are always the same, but all the verbal and visual cues that you expect that you're trained to think about when you start talking, not necessarily there, but I really appreciate Mark and everyone at the museums making this possible, especially given when we started talking about doing an event, it was always, this is going to be live, it'll be great. I would go visit my in-laws up around Boston, and I'd make a weekend of it. I'm just glad that we were able still to do this, because it's a real pleasure for me to be able to talk to people about my book, but also, like Mark said, really about anything that you all want to talk about. Just as an aside, my first book was, as Mark mentioned, called A Nation on Fire, and it was about the week after Martin Luther King was killed and the unrest and the politics, how sort of maybe we don't forget, maybe you don't forget, but certainly some people don't appreciate how important that was. And I published it. It came out. It was fun to do. Interesting. But suddenly it's very relevant, and so I'm happy to talk about that if anyone has any questions. I'm also happy to talk about whiskey, because it's been a long week, a long couple weeks, a long couple of months, and we could all use something to relax. So want to talk though about the book that I'm here to discuss, which is The Crowded Hour. Is a book about primarily, sort of first front and center about Theodore Roosevelt and the Riders and the Spanish-American War. But it's really a story about America at a time that I think we all sort of know in the back of our head was a really important moment, the sort of turn of the century, 1898, America kind of becoming a war. And yet I think lost in that is a lot of the nuance of what that meant and how the country went from what it was during the 19th century as a fairly isolated, fairly rural, agricultural country to being a manufacturing powerhouse and really then a global force. And I think the book tells that story. But what I want to start off with, and this is sort of how I start off these talks all the time, is, um, people ask me, well, look, aside from you've written about whiskey, but even the history books are primarily about post-war American history, uh, the riots or the unrest after King's assassination, the Civil Rights Act. My next book that I'm working now is about the Red Scare and sort of the politics of the Red Scare after World War II. And so, why would I then write a book that is really about a very different time period? And the easy answer is that I'm not an academic historian. I get to write about whatever I want, and it does. There's no agenda. There's no academic track, no career track. For me, it's whatever interests me. So, that's the easy answer. The more involved answer is that this is a topic that has always fascinated me, and long before I got into journalism, long before I got into writing history, I was fascinated with the Rough Riders. And there's a very particular reason. When I was a boy, when I was a kid, my Boy Scout troop was called the Rough Riders. That was our nickname. We were Troop 92, the Rough Riders. And I'm not going to run to my other room and get the gear that I have, but we had gear, hats and kerchiefs that had these kind of cartoon images of Theodore Roosevelt with a slouch hat and the big glasses. And that was in as much as Boy Scouts was a big deal to me. I really spent a lot of time in Boy Scouts, and it left a mark that the Rough Riders were part of my identity, even though I didn't actually know very much about it. But the one thing that I came away from, and was always kind of a lingering question in the back of my mind, was we had this logo, or the image of Theodore Roosevelt, and of course think of Theodore Roosevelt. When we think of the Rough Riders, we think about Theodore Roosevelt. But I always had in the back of my mind, well, who are the Rough Riders? Who are these other guys? And I never really, delved into that question until I had an opportunity to write a book about it. And I was actually looking for a book idea, and I had the idea of going back to obituaries from a while ago. So I was looking at obituaries from in the New York Times from the 1930s. And my thinking was, or I started in the 1930s, I was moving ahead. But my thinking was, obituaries are a great way to find told stories. Or, stories that someone decides, if someone dies and an obituary writer decides this person is worth commemorating, a lot of times they're worth commemorating because there's something important about them. And if you go back far enough, the importance has been forgotten, right? In the 30s, there were certain things that people thought important, certain people they thought were important, so they commemorated them when they died. That has passed away. I've been reading, this is great quarantine reading. I've been reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And it's one of the themes in Meditations, if you've ever read it. He writes a lot about how even the famous people have been forgotten because the people who thought they were famous have been forgotten. And it's sort of about the long process, the long erosive process of time, and how unimportant fame is. But it all sort of that's kind of the mindset that I was in. And I came across an obituary from 1935, and it was of a Rough Rider. It was one of the members of Theodore Roosevelt's regiment. And what struck me about this obituary was that the man that it was commemorating, that was that the author was writing about, was not particularly famous for any other reason. He was a stockbroker. He ended up working for a bank. He was not someone that otherwise the New York Times would have had anything to say about. But the fact that he was a Rough Rider made it very clear that this was someone we had to talk about. And so it got me thinking, it obviously reminded me of that moment or that time when I was a Boy Scout, but it also started to answer that question that I had when I was a kid, which was who were the Rough Riders? And let's say it jump started that question, because it occurred to me that the Rough Riders, if this guy was significant enough to commemorate, that maybe that means that there was a time when the Rough Riders as a group, not just Theodore Roosevelt, but as a group, were central, were celebrities, were enough to commemorate. And is there enough there, sort of as a hypothesis? You sort of approach these questions in somewhat of a scientific process. As a hypothesis, I think that there's something culturally significant about the Rough Riders as a collective that is in some ways connected to Theodore Roosevelt, but also in and of themselves. And so I started to think about, well, what are some of those questions? What would that be? And when we talk about the Rough Riders, we're talking about 1,000 men, not a small number. This was a full-size cavalry regiment at the time, and it was actually an oversized regiment. Most regiments were between 600 and 800. This one was augmented. It turns out that it was augmented because so many people wanted to be in it. And so I started to kind of dig into that question. If the Rough Riders were significant, well, what does that significance mean? Why were they significant? What did that significance say about the war? And how did that characterize what the Spanish-American War was? And what does that say about what America was? And the more I dug into it, the more kind of obvious some of the answers became. And it became clear that, yes, obviously Theodore Roosevelt is an incredibly important part of this story, and his fame elevates the fame of the men around him. But it also became pretty clear to me fairly early on that Theodore Roosevelt wasn't the only story. That actually, the fact that 1,000 men, and many more actually, it turned into like tens of thousands of men wanted to join the Rough Riders, but 1,000 men were actually chosen to join the Rough Riders. This was a volunteer regiment that was created explicitly and only to go fight in this war. About where the country was and where it was going. One thing you have to remember, and that I didn't really appreciate until this point, was that the Spanish-American War was the first war in which the United States went overseas to fight. Now we'd fought kind of a police action, sort of with Marines against the Barbary pirates. We had fought a war with Mexico, and obviously Cuba is not that far off, or it's not really overseas. It's 70 miles from Florida. But we went to war with Spain, and we went to war with a country that was an empire, and it was a fading empire. But we went to war with a European country, and we chose to go to war. There was nothing that obligated us to go to war, and yet the country poured into this fight. Ultimately, 1 million men volunteered for the Spanish-American War. The American Army at the time was, by law, limited to 28,000 soldiers and officers. So it's a tiny army. And when we declared war, suddenly we needed volunteers. And so hundreds of thousands of men were poured out from all over the country. And to me, that was an expression of something. That was an expression of a generational change. The country had been very chastened by the Civil War. The country America had, in a lot of ways, turned inward after the Civil War. And this was a new generation of people, kind of led by Theodore Roosevelt, looking outward and saying, well, we are a country that's just as good and potentially just as powerful as any European country. The Rough Riders were an expression of that. Because Theodore Roosevelt was famous, because he was such a photogenic, even they didn't have a lot of photographs at the time, but he was a photogenic, certainly charismatic character. the fact that he built this unit from scratch meant that the press turned out as well. And so it created this whole not microcosm, but really created this whole story of the war, the story of the country's idea about the war in miniature. Let me take one step back and just kind of talk about the war itself so I can sort of wrap all this together. The Spanish-American War is a very weird conflict in American history. We probably remember a little bit of it from, I mean, I certainly do. I don't know about you. A little bit from history class in high school, probably not college unless you studied American history. And we know that it was a very short war. We probably think that it was caused by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. But that's usually the be-all and end-all of it. And there's actually a much more fascinating story behind it that I think says something about what America was becoming. In 1895, so for decades leading up to the war, the native Cuban population, made up of both native Cubans, truly native Cubans, not Native Americans, but indigenous Cubans, as well as Spanish descended settlers. Spain had occupied Cuba for 400 years. So there were people whose families had been there for hundreds of years. Havana was the second largest city in the Spanish Empire after Madrid. And so there were people who had grown up there who had no relationship with Havana, with Madrid. And there had been wars, civil wars, insurrections. The most recent started in 1895, and these were terrible wars. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, mostly on the Cuban side, but also tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers were killed in tactics that are so familiar today, and yet at the time were new and shocking in their brutality. There were trench warfare, firing squads against masses of citizenry, retribution for the death of one soldier. They'd kill 100 villagers. Concentration camps it was the first documented use of concentration camps, and just a burn it to the ground kind of attitude about the countryside. And all of this was known to the American public. We saw this happening. The American public, by the end of the 19th century, as much as we were turned inward in a lot of ways, we were also much more aware of what was going on in the world. And mass media was bringing news through newspapers primarily to all parts of the country. It was fascinating for me to read newspapers from tiny towns in Montana and Denver, or not Denver, but Colorado, where the news was only a day behind the news in Washington or New York. You could really see the country as a whole kind of getting the same news at the same time. And a lot of that, and obviously that speaks to the literacy and the relative worldliness of the American people as a whole. And so people were aware of what was going on in Cuba, and they were disgusted by it. And you could slice the American public into all kinds of ways and find a reason why they were disgusted by it. If you were a diehard anti-Catholic, well, you saw this as an example of the Spanish Church in league with the Spanish Empire, going in and destroying the Cuban countryside. If you were an African American, you could look at the typical native Spaniard or native Cuban who was of much darker complexion than the white Spaniards and the white Cubans who were on the side of the Spanish. If you were a labor activist, you could look and say, well, this is obviously an example of the Spanish capitalists and the oppressors beating down the working class. if you were, if you were religiously motivated at all, you looked at this as simply a humanitarian disaster. But I'd say collectively, what Americans looked at and saw was a an example, almost a replay of what they saw in the American story. Like I'd said, the Spanish had occupied Cuba for hundreds of years. These were native Cubans who were rising up against a European empire and saying, "We want liberty." And Americans, whoever they were, responded to that, and they said, "Yes, that's what we went through." And we are an increasingly powerful country. We are an increasingly worldly country. We can no longer kind of isolate ourselves. And there was this conversation in America, in the newspapers, in Congress. It's fascinating to read some of the transcripts of congressional debates. Certainly among the leadership class, like Theodore Roosevelt and sort of his circles, and people talking about, well, what is this American power for? What are we going to do, and how are we different from Europe? We don't want to be, we're a powerful country, but we don't want to be powerful like Germany or Britain or France. We are a country of freedom, and we have an obligation, we feel, to bring that freedom to the world. And where can we do that? Well, we can do that in Cuba. And so there was constant pressure as the decade progressed, and particularly in the late 1890s, for the United States to do something. Now, people didn't necessarily want that to be an invasion. People, sort of a corollary of the American idea of itself was, we're a country of liberty. We're a country that doesn't need a large army. We're a country, we don't want a big army. And so the idea of invading Cuba was not really in the cards. The idea was really that we should pressure Spain, and we should buy Cuba, or we should diplomatically, put pressure on Spain to get out of Cuba. And President McKinley, who took office in 1897, was very much, he was publicly averse to getting too involved. Privately, it's what he wanted more than anything. McKinley gave money to the Red Cross anonymously to support refugees in Cuba, and he made it clear that when the time comes, he would support strong action. And really, so the story of the Spanish-American War was the failure of everything other than military action to dislodge the Spanish. In that context, the explosion of the Maine is really just one catalyst among many. The Maine had been sent to Havana Harbor really as kind of a diplomatic pressure. This happened in February of 1898. It was really a way of saying, we have boats, we have ships, we have an army. Don't mess with us. You should take us seriously. The battleship exploded. It's unlikely that it was caused by any kind of sabotage or any kind of subterfuge on anyone's part. It was probably an internal explosion, but it heightened the awareness among the American public that something had to be done, and made everyone just a little more eager to contemplate a military response. And so when a few months later, McKinley decided that there really was no other option other than declaring war, the country was 100% behind him. There's some myth out there. There's some stories that compare this to the Iraq War and say that, well, the American public wasn't really supportive. The American public was fooled into supporting the war, the Spanish-American War. And that's just simply not the case. There was widespread support. There was dissent. There was some pretty vocal dissent, but the public broadly supported going to war. And you see that in the numbers of people that turned out as volunteers to support the war. Now, Theodore Roosevelt himself was a huge supporter of the war. He was a huge supporter of the idea of kicking the Spanish out. both because of what was going on in Cuba and because of what he saw as, sort of the opportunity to demonstrate American power. He was what people called at the time a jingoist. He believed that America needed to be a powerful country in the world. He did subscribe to the idea that America needed to be a different kind of power, but fundamentally that America deserved a place at the table. And he felt that this was a great way to do that. Now, at the time, he was McKinley's deputy. He was called the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, that was essentially the Deputy Secretary of the Navy, and at the time, that was a wholly independent department, a wholly independent cabinet position. We didn't have this. We didn't have the Department of Defense. We had the Department of War, the Department of the Navy, and ironically, he was in the exact same position that his cousin Franklin Roosevelt would occupy 20 years later. Now, during World War I. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was in that position when war was declared. He was an active advocate of the war, as I said, and he helped prepare the Navy for its part in this war. The Navy played an incredibly important part in the war. But when the war broke out, he felt that he couldn't sit at a desk. Now, keep in mind that Theodore Roosevelt was 38 years old at the time. He was not really of age to volunteer. And he looked around, and there really weren't many opportunities for him to join an existing regiment. There were some, the equivalent of National Guard units in New York, where he was a resident. He could join one of those. He could work on a staff in the Department of War. There were lots of opportunities, but very clearly, all of those would keep him in the United States. And he wanted the experience of war. Now, there are a couple of reasons why. Some of them pretty, sort of self-regarding. He wanted to show that he was a manly man. There's a lot of truth to the fact that Theodore Roosevelt grew up with a certain chip on his shoulder in the era of Victorian masculinity, and he wanted to demonstrate that he was up there with the tough guys. But there was something honorable as well. He really wanted to say, look, I called for this war. This is something that I have been pushing for, and I can't do anything other than everything I can to get into a battle, because otherwise I won't feel, I'll feel like an armchair soldier, and I will forever be remembered like that. And I think there's something honorable there. So he quit his job at the Department of the Navy, and he immediately took up a position with a to-be-created regiment of volunteer cavalry soldiers. Now, this was partly his idea. He had lobbied for the creation of this. It was partly the idea of his best friend, Leonard Wood, who was a Medal of Honor winner, but also the surgeon for the White House surgeon. And they had both said to McKinley, look, not only do we not have enough soldiers, but even if we get a bunch of volunteers, it's going to take a while to train them. So what if we created a regiment or a few regiments of men drawn from particular walks of life, cowboys, veterans, police officers, college athletes. You can imagine different walks of life that might prepare someone for a martial existence. Maybe they can shoot. Maybe they know how to live roughly. Maybe they're just ready for adventure. But we could create that unit, and we could bring men together and give them minimal amount of training, and that would be a lot better than the kind of all-call open regiments that we're going to have in a lot of other cases. And McKinley said, well, that's a great idea. So they created 3 regiments like this. The only one that really got off the ground at all was the first United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, which we know as the Rough Riders. uh, immediately, because of Roosevelt's fame, because of just because of the moment, applications poured in, and ultimately 10, 12,000 men volunteered. Uh, they could only take 1,000, and they met in San Antonio. Roosevelt got on a train, went out to San Antonio. They trained there, and then they took a train to Florida. They got on a boat in Florida and went to Cuba and ended up participating in the major conflicts. They were right there, and they fought very well. The Rough Riders turned out to be a really pretty fantastic regiment. Given everything, they were well led. Roosevelt was very good at his um, his captains and picking his majors. So he had great guys underneath him. He also learned very quickly how to lead in battle. And all the stories that you hear are largely true. The stories about the charge up San Juan Hill, which was the only thing that's not true, is it was actually up a different hill called Kettle Hill, and then over to San Juan Hill. But the basic idea is true, that they were pinned down. The Spanish were very well entrenched, and that Roosevelt had, I think, the courage and the wherewithal to, under all of that fire, to say the only way forward is up that hill. And I had the opportunity to go to Cuba and to actually walk around Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and to see what that was like and to try to imagine what that fighting would have been. And it was terrible, and a lot of men were killed, a lot of men were hit, but they conquered. They captured the hill, and after a siege period, the Spanish surrendered. And that was, while that wasn't the whole surrender of Cuba, it was essentially the end of the war. Uh, Now the war continued in another form in the Philippines, and this is sort of outside the scope of my book, but the Philippines had also been conquered, and that turned into, ironically, a very similar insurrection, very dirty war. But in this case, the Americans were the ones who were uh, playing the role of the Spanish, I guess you could say, where they were pretty brutal to the insurrectionists, the Filipino insurrectionists. Now, that was all kind of in the future to the story that I tell, which really ends with 1898. The Rough Riders came home. They spent a time in quarantine out on Montauk. It's kind of funny, actually, to go back and read the stories of them in quarantine and us in quarantine today. The concern was that they would bring back tropical diseases, and they did. Some of them did. But after they were done, they were allowed back into New York City, and they were celebrities. To be a Rough Rider was the coolest thing imaginable. At the end of 1898, they set fashion trends. The hat of the season, the woman's hat, was called the Rough Rider. It was this kind of slouch, almost like a beret kind of hat. It came in mink and Nutria, which, if anyone of you has ever been to New Orleans or Louisiana, you know what a Nutria is. And that we don't really use Nutria fur anymore. We don't usually fur anymore, but Nutria fur was much more common back then. They couldn't buy a drink. They couldn't buy a meal. They couldn't buy a Broadway ticket. Everyone paid for everything. They couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. And Thomas Edison, who coincidentally was the brother-in-law of one of the Rough Riders, he was obsessed with the Rough Riders. He had just really perfected the motion picture camera. And he, that fall, recreated the charge up San Juan Hill, but in Central Park. And people were a lot more, the suspension of disbelief and the willingness to just imagine what isn't there was a little easier back then, I guess. But he made these films, and the films went around. I mean, that was what people wanted to see in 1898, 1899. So to be a Rough Rider very quickly became not just a mark of celebrity, but also a mark of the war itself. The idea that men of civilian backgrounds would come together to go off to liberate Cuba was a ready-made myth for America. Now, there are all kinds of details that undermine that myth, and we can get into that. But the myth was created, and it helped reinforce this idea going into the 20th century of what America was. And there's truth to it, and there's myth to it. But the idea that America was a different kind of world power, that America was a country that went out not to conquer the world, but to liberate the world. And we see this time and again. You see this in the rhetoric that Woodrow Wilson used to justify going into World War I. You see this in the rhetoric that Franklin Roosevelt used during World War II. You see this again in Korea, again in Vietnam, again in Iraq, time and time again. And we've become inured to it. We've become very skeptical of it. But what I try to do with the book is to step back from that and to try to be, as a historian, try to recreate what it must have felt like to be an American in 1898, and to look at Theodore Roosevelt, and to look at the Rough Riders, and to look at what happened in Cuba, and to say, this is what America is. This is what we conceive America as being. This is what we think. This is what we think the new America should be. This is what the 20th century should look like. Now, that wasn't always what it looked like. There were periods of isolationism, and there were periods of great skepticism. But I think that if you looked at the 20th century and you said, what was America's role? What did America think of itself? You couldn't find a better root stock for that idea than this story that I hope that I tell well in The Crowded Hour. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks and open the floor, turn it back to Mark, open the floor to anybody who has questions. Like I said, we can talk about the book. We can talk about other books that I've written, whatever you want to talk about.
All right, as I mentioned before, if you got a question, type it down in the chat area. A question for you, Clay, and that I think for all of us that go back into looking at how the Spanish-American War was written up in textbooks, certainly now, I don't know about then, but it's always kind of been that's the tale of American imperialism. That's where it began, and in some regards, it was like the social Darwinism that that America was part of this Anglo-European thing that as we are superior, so we have to get our colonies and show that. It sounds to me like at the time, that wasn't what was being. That's not how Americans felt in 1898 necessarily. The everyday American. Would that be true?
Yeah, I mean that's where I think the idea with the notion of the myth is very important. And when I say myth, I don't mean to be derogatory, but there's both of those stories are true, right? It is an instance of American imperialism. It is a moment when America is saying, we're great and we're going to go out and we're going to impose ourselves on the world. Now that's not the story that Americans were telling themselves. And that's not mutually exclusive with an identity and a belief among Americans that what they're doing is they're bringing freedom. Even in the worst instance of American imperialism, which is the occupation of the Philippines, worst in that it's the baldest example, worst in that we did terrible things to the Filipinos, that we, not only in the insurrection, but also just the basic idea that we lied to them. And we said, well, we're going to liberate you. We ended up occupying them. Even then, the conception at home was broadly that we were doing the right thing, and that when things turned south, it was more of an example of overreach rather than some fundamental mistake. Theodore Roosevelt, who was in office during most of this time as vice president and then as president, didn't really regret what we did in the Philippines. He regretted that things had gone sour, but it's not like he ever said, well, this is why I was wrong to advocate for American expansionism. Now, there were a lot of voices that dissented, and this is really important, Mark Twain was a very vocal and very, as you can imagine, very well spoken critic of the very fundamental fact that America was, despite its own assertions, was becoming an empire and was doing terrible things in order to do that. And one of the reasons why I think America did pull back and did not really become an empire in the conventional European sense is because of that that quagmire in the Philippines. But none of that erased the basic conviction on the part of many Americans that when we go out into the world, we are a force for good. And that, I think, is, in some ways, it's very important that this happened the way it did, because it shows how deeply ingrained that idea became very quickly.
Okay, we have a question here. It says, liberation of quote-unquote white Cubans as opposed to indigenous Cubans. Just curious, considering U.S. treatment of our own indigenous people.
Yes. And this is, I get into this in the book, but I think this is a really important point. So there are a few things. And here I'm going to talk mostly about our treatment of African Americans, because it's more front and center to this particular conversation. But or it's front and center to what people thought at the time. For largely, it's among the many tragedies of the way that we treated our Native Americans in the United States is that we really didn't think about the way we treated Native Americans in the United States. So when the United States, during the buildup to the invasion of Cuba, and then the occupation of it, during the invasion, the buildup and then the invasion, there was an image of what Cuba was, and by image I mean very literally. The way that Cuba was depicted in political cartoons was always as a white woman and a damsel in distress. There was really no conception that Cubans looked anything other than white European. And so when the United States invaded, it's very important to keep in mind that the place where we landed, Southwest Cuba, is and this was as true, it's as true today. It was true when I went there a couple of years ago. It was certainly true 100 years ago, or 120 years ago. That is, the population there is demographically, is ethnically very different from the population in Havana. And Havana is much more European. The population in Southwest or Southeast Cuba, around Santiago, is much more indigenous. It's much more Afro, the sort of Afro-Caribbean mix. It's much more Creole. And so when the Americans landed, the white Americans in particular, and I'll get to this, but it was actually, there were white and black regiments that landed. The white regiments that landed, including the Rough Riders, were shocked to find that the vast majority of the Cubans that they interacted with were very dark-skinned, either because they were of African descent or because they were native descent, or typically some combination. What they were also shocked about was that the rebels that they interacted with, the whole idea was that we would team up with rebels and we would all sort of fight together. The rebels themselves were predominantly made up of people of darker skin color, and they were shocked, and some of them were deeply offended to find that the leadership, the generals and the commanders of these units, were darker skinned, and that in many cases their subordinates were lighter skinned. The whole picture was so anathema to what Americans had thought of race. They were, and there's a great irony that here's a country that not only had enslaved its African American population, but was in the process of instituting Jim Crow at home, and arrived on the shores of Cuba with a segregated army, that they were teaming up with an integrated army that in most cases was led by people of darker, of Native and African descent. And one of the problems that they had in working with the Cubans was that many Americans just couldn't just they couldn't go there. They couldn't accept that idea, and so they rejected the idea that they would fight with the Cubans at all. And in most cases, the Cubans were completely sidelined. Now, in letters written home, I don't want to portray the Rough Riders as any better or worse than any other regiment. But the fact I did have, because I focused on them, I did read letters that they wrote, and some of them were had no problem at all, and they were in awe, and they were very eager to fight alongside these men. Others were terribly racist, kind of what you'd expect. They said, "I will not fight. I can't believe that we came all this way to fight for these people." I mean, that was pretty much verbatim from several letters, and it's the way that we treated them after. Once once the war was over, former Spanish, sort of demilitarized Spanish soldiers were given day-to-day tasks, management tasks. There's a lot of the sort of similar to what happened in Iraq. We sort of turned over power to people that did not have a lot of authority, moral authority, but we liked them, and so it's almost immediately we sort of imposed our own prejudices on our leadership in Cuba, and just to follow up real quick on the presence of African American soldiers. Now, a lot of these were regiments that were known kind of as the Buffalo Soldiers. A lot of them had been based out west, fighting, or not so much fighting, but sort of just by that period, just kind of keeping the peace in rural America. Most of them had never lived in the South, had never been to the South, and I mentioned they passed through Tampa. That was where the whole expedition started, and there were weeks where these regiments were just sitting there in Tampa, and there were terrible instances of racial of rioting, of fighting between white and black soldiers and white townspeople, because you had Jim Crow was already pretty well instituted in that part of the country, and so it was very eye-opening for a lot of these soldiers. They were very proud to be American soldiers, despite the fact that they were in segregated regiments. They were very proud of the service, and they fought incredibly well in in Cuba. One of the marks, I would say one of the stains on Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is that while he was fighting and immediately afterward, he was full of praise for the African American soldiers that he fought alongside, including in that charge up San Juan Hill. They were right there with him. But later, when he was running for public office, particularly when he was running for the vice presidency, he disavowed those soldiers, and he said, "Well, they actually didn't fight that well, and the only reason they fought decently at all was because they were led by white officers." And I read a lot of letters and papers by African American soldiers who had fought in that conflict, and they had a very the disappointment was palpable. They were very proud to have fought. They were very proud to have been praised by Theodore Roosevelt, and then they felt betrayed when he disavowed them later. So it's an incredibly ugly story, very complicated story. But I think also, the 20th century is a very complicated story, and this is just kind of the first step in that.
I think you actually answered Deb Seegert's question too, in that, because she had asked the next question had been, how did Teddy and the Rough Riders deal with the Buffalo Soldier? I think you just touched on that. What was the role of Pulitzer and Hearst in making the public aware of and in favor of going to war?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, they were both very eager to see a war happen. They both fomented pro-war sentiment. What I think is important to note, there are two. So that's also part of the story, right? That we get told about basically how Hearst created this war. Um, I think this is just in my study of the work, but I think this is reflected in a lot of the more recent scholarship on the Spanish-American War, that ultimately they were reflecting public opinion rather than guiding it, and that their impact, broadly speaking, is often overplayed. While they owned a lot of newspapers in big cities, particularly in New York and San Francisco, their reach into the rest of the country was minimal. That a lot of times, if you were in a newspaper in, let's say, like Wichita, what you were getting were wire stories and the national stuff, and it was, and that was AP stuff. There you might get stuff from mixed in there from a Pulitzer or a Hearst paper, but broadly speaking, you were drawing from a lot of sources, and as well, a lot of these medium-sized cities had their own reporters. By then, they had reporters who might not be going to Cuba, but they were in Washington, they were in New York. Um, they were picking up stories totally separate from what Hearst and Pulitzer were doing. I think it's important to see them as part of the picture, but ultimately not in the kind of simplistic Hearst wanted a war and therefore there was a war picture that we sometimes get in the kind of common narrative about the Spanish-American War.
We have a question here. Can you discuss how we obtained Puerto Rico in the peace deal?
Yeah, so Spain and Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last two Western Hemisphere holdings, last two territories under Spanish control. And so we went after Cuba. That was the big one. And we did actually, there was a Puerto Rico campaign soon after that. The United States, in large part, the same soldiers, some fresh regiments as well, landed in Puerto Rico. By that time, though, the Spanish will had been broken. I think it's pretty obvious once you look at some of the Spanish side of things that they were willing to give up Cuba and Puerto Rico with a fight, right? They basically insisted that there be a war so that they could have a certain element of honor. So once Cuba fell, the Spanish were not going to fight for Puerto Rico. And so the Americans landed on the western side, I think Ponce, and moved pretty quickly eastward. And within a couple of weeks, with very minimal fighting, I mean, in most cases, it was sort of accidental fighting. Units that meant to surrender, but someone took a shot, that kind of thing. And the Puerto Ricans, the Puerto Ricans were welcoming them. There hadn't really been fighting in Puerto Rico like there had been in Cuba. There really wasn't an insurrection, but the Puerto Ricans were happy, at least at first, to see the Americans arrive as what was assumed to be as liberators. And we know that is not the story. But the Americans arrived with liberty in hand, and they were received that way.
Yeah, Judith, you have a question?
And I don't quite know how to do chat. My grandfather fought in the Spanish-American War. He was 18 years old. He was one of what I can find many regiments that were raised in Massachusetts. They ended up in Cuba, and I'm not sure they ever even got off the boat. So they were there 3 months, and that's all I know. So my question to you is, did you learn anything about other regiments besides the Rough Riders? What did they do? And when they came home, what was their reception?
Yes. So not as much as I learned about the Rough Riders, but I did. I will say there was a Massachusetts regiment, or there were Massachusetts soldiers who fought in the battle they fought in a side battle kind of just north of the battle for San Juan Hill. So there's San Juan Hill. There was another battle at another town that was kind of considered strategically important. and the Americans thought it would be easy to walk in and take the town, and it ended up being a really pretty terrible battle. And I know there were a lot of Massachusetts soldiers there, but I don't know if they were from a Massachusetts regiment or if they were part of the regular army. Generally speaking, the war didn't last long enough for most volunteers to get a piece of the action. Most of them, by the time they were trained, the war was basically over. The ones that were sent to Cuba mostly went there as kind of occupation forces. That the first wave, the ones who weren't killed in battle, hundreds of them, more died of disease than died in battle. And that was true of the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were decimated several times over by disease, and they were replaced by fresh regiments. And then many regiments never made it. They just sat in camps back in the stateside. My guess is if your grandfather was there, there's a decent chance that he fought in combat. There's also a chance that he was part of that second wave, because those soldiers did tend to stay longer. They had better supplies. They had more. They were able to use Santiago as a town instead of having to be out in the jungle. They used Santiago as a port. They could get supplies. So those regiments stayed longer than the ones that arrived first, most of which were either repurposed for Puerto Rico or sent home. So it's just as likely that it was one or the other. But I will say that it's something that he made it to Cuba in the first place, because, like I said, most soldiers never actually did.
All right. Any other questions? I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I want to, Clay told me right before we started that this book is actually coming out in paperback in a couple weeks, you said?
On the 16th, June
Okay.
16th.
So Eight Cousins in Falmouth has it in hardcover, but obviously it's coming out in paperback as well. So if you want to get it in hardcover, you can get it now. If you want to wait a couple weeks, you can get it then. So we want to thank Clay. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate the time. I want to appreciate everyone for spending their time with us tonight. Our next talk will be Tuesday night. Casey Sherman will be here talking about hunting Whitey Bulger. Stay safe, everyone. Clay, thank you very much. Good luck with this book.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everyone for attending. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, everybody.